In the spring of 1861, the United States of America split in two, not through a gradual falling apart, but through a sudden and violent rupture that turned American soldiers against American soldiers, tore families apart along geographic lines, and produced 4 years of warfare so devastating that it remains to this day the deadliest conflict in American history. By the time it was over, somewhere between 600,000 and 800,000 people had lost their lives. The country that emerged from it was fundamentally different from the one that had entered it. To understand how that happened, it is necessary to understand the single issue that had pulling the country apart since before it was even fully formed: slavery. The United States was built on a contradiction. Its founding documents declared that all men were created equal and that liberty was an unalienable right. At the same time, the economy of the southern states were built almost entirely on the forced labor of enslaved black people, millions of whom had been brought from Africa or born into bondage on American soil, with no rights, no freedom, and no legal recognition as human beings. The founding generation knew this contradiction existed. Many of them privately acknowledged it was wrong, and almost none of them did anything meaningful to resolve it, because doing so would have threatened the economic and political power of the southern states and potentially prevented the country from coming together in the first place. So the contradiction was left in place, and it festered for decades. The tension between the northern and southern states was not simply about slavery in that abstract. It was about whether slavery should be allowed to spread into the new territories as the United States expanded westward. The South depended on slavery for its entire economic model and wanted to see it extend into new states. The North, which had industrialized and moved away from slave labor, was increasingly uncomfortable with the idea of slavery spreading further, partly for moral reasons and partly for economic ones. Free labor could not easily compete with enslaved labor, and Northern workers and businesses did not want to find themselves competing against a system built on zero wages. A series of uneasy political compromises had held the country together through the first half of the 19th century, drawing lines on maps and deciding which new territories would be slave states and which would be free. Each compromise brought time but solved nothing. Each time a new territory came up for consideration, the fight broke out again, louder and more bitter than before. By the 1850s, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. A federal law was passed requiring citizens in free states to assist in the capture and return of people who had escaped slavery in the South, even if those people were living freely in states where slavery was illegal. The fury this produced in the North was enormous. A book written by a Northern author depicting the brutal reality of life under slavery became one of the best-selling books in the country and hardened Northern public opinion against the institution in a way that no political speech had managed. Violence broke out in newly settled territories between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers. A radical abolitionist led an armed raid on federal weapons depot in Virginia in an attempt to trigger a mass uprising among enslaved people in the South. He was captured, tried, and hung, but the fact that many in the North viewed him as a hero terrified Southern leaders. Into this atmosphere came a presidential election in 1860 that changed everything. A candidate from the newly formed Republican Party, which was explicitly opposed to the expansion of slavery into new territories, won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state. He did not even appear on the ballot in most of them. The Southern states had warned that if such a candidate won, they would leave the Union. They meant it. Within months of the election, 11 Southern states had formally voted to secede, declaring themselves a separate nation called the Confederate States of America. The new Confederate government argued that states had the right to leave the Union if they choose to, and that the federal government had no authority to force them to remain. The Northern government and the newly elected president argued the opposite. The Union was permanent, secession was illegal, and the federal government would use force if necessary to preserve it. Both sides expected the conflict to be short. It was not. The first shots were fired in April 1861 when the Confederate forces opened fire on a federal military installation in South Carolina. The garrison inside eventually surrendered. The Civil War had begun. In the early stages, the Confederate military performed surprisingly well. Its generals were experienced, its soldiers were highly motivated, and it was fighting a defensive war on the home ground, which carried significant advantages. The Confederacy did not need to conquer the North. It only needed to hold on long enough for the North to decide the fight was not worth the cost. or for European powers to recognize it as a legitimate nation and provide support. The North, despite having a much larger population, a vastly stronger industrial base, and control of most of the country's railroads and manufacturing, struggled to translate those advantages into decisive military victories in the early years. A series of costly and embarrassing defeats, some of them alarmingly close to the northern capital, raised real questions about whether the war could be won. The nature of the conflict shifted in 1862 and 1863 in ways that made it impossible to contain. The Northern government issued a proclamation declaring that all enslaved people in Confederate states were free. This was not a purely humanitarian gesture. It was also a military political calculation. It transformed the war from a conflict about preserving the Union into a war about slavery itself, which made it far harder for European powers sympathetic to the South to offer their support without appearing to endorse slavery. It also encouraged enslaved people in the South to resist, flee, and eventually join the Northern military in large numbers. By the end of the war, nearly 200,000 black men had served in the Northern Army and Navy. The turning point came in the summer of 1863, when the Confederacy attempted its second major invasion of the North. A massive 3-day battle in the Pennsylvania countryside ended in a devastating Confederate defeat. On the same day that battle concluded, a Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River finally fell after a long siege, giving Northern forces complete control of that crucial waterway and effectively cutting the Confederates in two. The South would never fully recover from those twin blows. But the war dragged on for almost 2 more years. The Confederacy, even in retreat, proved an extraordinarily difficult opponent to finish off. Its armies kept fighting. Its generals kept finding ways to slow the Northern advance. A strategy of total war emerged in the North, one that deliberately targeted not just Confederate armies, but the entire economic infrastructure and civilian morale of the South. Northern forces marched through the heart of the Confederacy, destroying railroads, burning supplies, and leaving a path of destruction that made it impossible for Confederate forces to be fed, equipped, or reinforced. By early 1865, the end was clearly coming. Confederate forces were shrinking through casualties, desertion, and sheer exhaustion. Supply lines had collapsed. Entire regions of the South had been laid waste. In April 1865, the main Confederate army surrendered. Within weeks, the remaining Confederate forces had laid down their arms. The Civil War was over. What it left behind was a country that had to be rebuilt almost from scratch, at least in the South. 4 million enslaved people were suddenly free, with no land, no money, no education, and no legal infrastructure to support them. Constitutional amendments were passed abolishing slavery, granting citizenship to Black Americans, and guaranteeing Black men the right to vote. For a brief period known as Reconstruction, the federal government attempted to rebuild the southern states and integrate formerly enslaved people into full civic people. That effort was eventually abandoned. Northern political will faded. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South. And the white political leadership of the southern states have moved quickly and systematically to strip Black Americans of the rights they had just been granted through a combination of new laws, economic coercion, and the widespread campaign of racial terror carried out by groups like the Ku Klux Klan. The system of racial segregation and disenfranchisement that replaced slavery kept Black Southerners in conditions of profound inequality for another century. The Civil War ended slavery. It did not end the consequences of slavery. Those consequences rippled forward through American history in ways the country is still grappling with today. The war itself had been about many things. It had been about the right of states to leave the Union. It had been about economic systems and political power and the future of the rapidly expanding country. But at the center of it all, undeniable and inescapable, was slavery. The Confederate Constitution explicitly protected it. Confederate leaders explicitly said in their founding documents that the preservation of slavery was the cornerstone of their new nation. The war was fought because one half of the country was willing to tear itself apart rather than see the institution threatened, and the other half eventually decided it was worth fighting to hold the country together and ultimately to end it. What emerged from 4 years of the deadliest fighting America has ever known was a reunified country, a formal end to slavery, and a set of unresolved questions about race, equality, and justice that no battlefield victory had the power to fully answer.